If you've been adding salt right before cooking, stop. Seriously. You might be ruining your food without even realizing it. For years I thought salt was just salt. Sprinkle it on, toss it in, done. That's what everyone does, right? But one simple mistake changes everything. The texture, the flavor, even how juicy your food turns out. Professional chefs know this. Home cooks usually don't. And once you see the difference, you can't unsee it. The real secret isn't how much salt you use, it's exactly where, and when, you put it. A few years ago, I remember standing in my kitchen, staring at a perfectly good piece of meat that somehow tasted ordinary. It looked beautiful. Golden on the outside. Cooked just right. But the flavor? Flat. I followed the recipe exactly. I added the salt like it said. I did everything right. So why didn't it taste like the restaurant version? That question bothered me more than it should have. And the answer surprised me. It wasn't the quality of the food. It wasn't the pan. It wasn't even the amount of salt. It was the placement. The timing. The exact moment the salt touched the surface. That tiny detail, something most people never think about, completely changed the result. And once I understood it, every dish I made started tasting deeper, richer, and more balanced. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what most people get wrong. The common mistake explained. Here's what almost everyone does. You take your food, maybe it's a steak, chicken breast, vegetables, or even eggs, and right before it hits the pan, you sprinkle salt on top. Or worse, you wait until it's already cooking and throw the salt in at the last second. It feels logical. Salt is for flavor, right? So you add it when you're ready to eat. Simple. That's exactly what I used to think. And to be fair, it seems harmless. The food still cooks. It still looks good. You still taste salt. So where's the problem? The problem is timing. Salt doesn't just sit on food and magically add flavor. The moment salt touches the surface, it starts working. It pulls moisture out. It begins dissolving. It changes the structure of proteins. But when you add it too late, you interrupt that process. Let's imagine a piece of steak. When you salt it seconds before cooking, the salt pulls moisture to the surface almost immediately. But because there's no time, that moisture just sits there. Then the steak goes into the hot pan, and instead of searing properly, it starts steaming. Steam is the enemy of crust. Instead of that deep golden brown exterior, you get a pale, slightly gray surface. And flavor is built in that crust. Now think about vegetables. If you salt them at the wrong time, they release water while cooking, becoming soggy instead of crisp. You blame the pan. You blame the oil. But it was the salt. Even eggs. Add salt too early to scrambled eggs, and they can turn watery. Add it too late, and the flavor sits on the surface instead of blending into the texture. The mistake isn't dramatic. It's subtle. That's why most people never notice it. They just think, this tastes fine. But fine is not amazing. And what's fascinating is this: professional chefs are extremely intentional about when they salt. They don't do it randomly. They understand that salt is not just seasoning, it's a tool. A chemical trigger. A flavor amplifier that behaves differently depending on when it's used. And this is where almost everyone gets it wrong. Because the secret isn't about using more salt. It's about putting it in the right place, at the right time. The secret reveal. Here's the secret. You don't just salt your food right before cooking. You salt it earlier than you think. In many cases, especially with meat, the best time to add salt is at least 40 minutes before cooking, or even the night before. Yes, hours ahead. Not seconds. At first, that sounds wrong. Wouldn't that dry it out? Wouldn't it pull all the moisture away? That's what most people assume. But here's what actually happens. When salt first touches the surface, it does draw moisture out. You'll even see tiny beads of water forming. And if you stopped the process right there, if you cooked it immediately, you'd get that steaming effect we talked about earlier. But if you wait, something powerful happens. That moisture dissolves the salt. Then, slowly, the salted liquid gets reabsorbed back into the meat. And when it goes back in, it carries the seasoning deep below the surface. Not just on top. Inside. Now instead of a salty crust with bland interior, you get flavor in every bite. And there's more. Salt begins gently breaking down muscle proteins. That might sound technical, but here's what it really means: the texture becomes more tender. The meat holds onto its juices better during cooking. You get a better sear because the surface is drier when it hits the pan. Crisp outside. Juicy inside. That's the difference. Not more salt. Not fancy ingredients. Just timing. Professional kitchens call this dry brining. But at home, it's simply patience. And once you understand this, you stop thinking of salt as something you add. You start thinking of it as something you prepare with. But this principle doesn't stop at meat. Because where you place salt, not just when, changes everything. Why it works, science plus logic. To really understand why this works, you have to stop thinking of salt as just a seasoning and start seeing it as a chemical tool. Salt is sodium chloride. When it hits food, especially protein, it immediately begins interacting at a molecular level. That interaction is what changes everything. Let's go step by step. When salt touches raw meat, it draws moisture to the surface through osmosis. This is the part most people know and misunderstand. They see moisture forming and assume the meat is losing juices. But that's only phase 1. If you give it time, that surface moisture dissolves the salt crystals into a concentrated brine. And here's the important part: that brine doesn't just sit there. It slowly moves back into the meat. As it travels inward, it carries sodium ions with it. Those ions begin loosening tightly wound muscle proteins. Imagine those proteins like coiled springs. When they're tight, they squeeze out moisture during cooking. When salt relaxes them, they hold on to water more effectively. That's why properly pre-salted meat stays juicier, not drier. Now let's talk about the surface. When you salt early and give the food time to rest uncovered, the exterior becomes slightly drier before cooking. A dry surface is critical for browning. Browning happens through something called the Maillard reaction, the chemical reaction between amino acids and sugars under high heat. Moisture blocks this reaction. If water is present, the energy from the pan goes into evaporating water instead of creating that golden crust. But when the surface is dry, heat can immediately trigger browning. That's where deep flavor develops. That's where complexity comes from. This is why chefs obsess over dry surfaces. Now think about vegetables. Salt pulls water from cell walls. If you salt zucchini or eggplant and let them sit briefly, excess moisture leaves before cooking. When you then sauté them, they caramelize instead of turning mushy. Even with pasta, timing matters. Salt belongs in the water before the pasta goes in, not sprinkled after. Why? Because starch absorbs water while cooking. If the water is seasoned, the pasta becomes seasoned from within. If not, you're just coating the outside later. See the pattern? Salt is most powerful when it has time to interact, not when it's rushed. It's not about intensity. It's about penetration. And that's the difference between food that tastes seasoned and food that tastes complete. Mini story / proof moment. I tested this once in the simplest way possible. 2 identical steaks. Same cut. Same thickness. Same pan. Same heat. Same oil. The only difference? Salt timing. The first one, I salted right before it went into the pan, the way most people do. The second one, I salted and left uncovered in the fridge overnight. The next day, I cooked them side by side. Immediately, I noticed something. The pre-salted steak hit the pan and sizzled differently. It sounded sharper. Cleaner. There was less steam rising from the surface. Within minutes, a deep golden crust started forming, not pale, not gray, but rich brown. The other steak? It released moisture almost instantly. Steam clouded the pan. The surface struggled to brown evenly. When they were done, I let them rest and sliced them open. The difference was obvious. The overnight salted steak was evenly pink from edge to edge. Juices stayed inside. Every bite tasted seasoned, not just the crust, but the center too. The flavor felt deeper, rounder, more complete. The other one wasn't bad. It just wasn't impressive. The inside needed finishing salt. The texture felt slightly tighter. It tasted like something was missing, even though technically, nothing was. That's when it clicked. It wasn't about skill. It wasn't about expensive ingredients. It was about understanding how salt actually works, and giving it time to do its job. Bonus secret, retention extension. Now here's something most people really don't expect. Sometimes, you shouldn't add salt at the beginning at all. Yes, after everything we just said. Because salt timing depends on what you're cooking. Take mushrooms, for example. If you salt them too early in the pan, they immediately release water. Instead of browning, they boil in their own moisture. You end up with soft, rubbery mushrooms instead of golden, caramelized ones. The trick? Let them brown first. Develop color. Build flavor. Then salt toward the end to control moisture. Or think about crispy foods, like French fries. If you salt before frying, moisture interferes with crispness. But salting immediately after they come out of hot oil. That's when the surface is ready to grab onto seasoning. Even scrambled eggs are a debate among chefs. Some salt early for tenderness. Others salt at the end for texture control. The key isn't copying blindly, it's understanding the effect. That's the real secret. Salt isn't just something you add automatically. It's something you strategically place. Early for penetration. Late for control. Always with intention. Once you start thinking this way, cooking stops feeling random. It becomes deliberate. So the next time you reach for the salt shaker, pause for a second. Ask yourself, am I adding this out of habit, or with intention? Because that small decision, a few minutes earlier, a few hours earlier, or a few seconds later, can completely transform what ends up on your plate. Not because salt is magical, but because it's powerful when you understand it. Cooking isn't about complicated techniques or expensive tools. It's about tiny adjustments that create massive differences. And salt, more than almost any other ingredient, rewards patience and awareness. Once you taste the difference between food that's simply salted and food that's properly seasoned from within, you won't go back. Try it tonight. Take one dish you make all the time and change only the timing of the salt. Nothing else. Then pay attention. Notice the crust. Notice the texture. Notice the depth of flavor. And when you do, you'll realize, it was never about using more salt. It was about putting it in the right place all along.